Okay, so I think I haven't asked you guys this one before. Maybe it is what was the forbidden flying stunt that killed one of Wesley's friends? Does that sound familiar?
Yes, this is the Tom Paris episode, except he wasn't called
Yes.
Tom
He
Paris.
wasn't called
Yeah,
Tom Paris at the
and it
time.
was
And you realize at some point that you've done the wrong thing. Well, it might be controversial because I might be wrong.
welcome to a piece of the action. I'm Micah,
I'm Eric.
And I'm Greg.
and today we're going to be looking at Antiquity. All right, Antiquity from 2004, designed by Jeroen Domen and Joris Wiersinga. 2 to 4 players, 2 to 3 hours. Does that sound right to you guys?
Yes, except it's Joris and Jeroen is their first names.
So
And I think it's
I want to
Virsinga
say
is the last name.
right. So I want to say that I saw those names and I thought, we've done running jokes before on this channel about me mispronouncing things, and I thought, let me to mix it up, let me roll the dice on it, and that's what I get. Okay.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm probably butchering it also, but I believe I'm slightly closer
Yes,
to it than
but
you. So.
I was polite enough not to immediately call that out.
Hey,
So,
a moment to fix one moment of embarrassment to fix a lifetime of embarrassment.
right, because I'm going to be referring to this game for the rest of my life, I'm sure. All right. Okay, well, so let's get into our initial thoughts then about Antiquity. First of all, Greg, why don't you give us a little synopsis of what this game is? Maybe talk about some, basic flow of how you play.
Sure. So this is basically Splotter's take, and Splotter's the publisher, composed of those two designers. Pretty much their take on the civilization genre. This is based 1050 to 1620, the years. So it's the Middle Ages, vaguely set in the Italian countryside. It's kind of where it is loosely based in, where you, like most civilization games, you're starting with a single city, and then you're building new buildings, new technologies that you can now expand out, build other cities. The goal of this game is actually kind of interesting because at some point in the game, you're going to build your cathedral. And when you build your cathedral, you choose your goal. So you start with no goal. So one of the goals could be something like collect 3 of every resource that's in the game. Could be a goal. That cathedral also give you a special ability that kind of helps you towards that goal. So that's what you're working towards. The way the actual game works on each turn is you go through these 10 steps, which I kind of, in my head, kind of break down to 3 major areas. So everyone works on their city board simultaneously. And the city board is kind of your own private, like zoomed in view of your city where all your buildings and workers are. And in that phase, you can build new buildings and set your workers on the buildings that you want to use in that turn. So everything in this game happens by having a worker on a particular building. Then you go at what I think of as like the field phase, like where you actually now out on the shared map in the middle, where you send your workers out to do various things, mostly like collecting resources. For example, you can send out a guy to become a woodcutter, and he'll collect wood now for the next few turns. You can send him out to build a new city or a new inn that gives you, expand your boundaries, all these different types of things. Interestingly enough, when you do collect resources in this game, usually it becomes pollution, so you can no longer resource collect from that same spot again. So that's kind of like the field phase. Then at the end, there's like this whole phase where the game gets to take a few licks at you. So for example, depending on how many cities you have to intentionally pollute non-polluted areas around your cities. So it just kind of like whittles down the resources available to you. You have to check for famine, which is a number that goes up once per turn. So you have to have that amount of food. You don't have to spend it, but just have that amount of food to take care of the famine in your city. And that gets worse and worse as the game goes on. So all that's happening. And for every time you start missing out on this pollution and famine, you start collecting graves in your city, which starts filling up your cities, eventually starts taking over your buildings. And if you can't place any more graves in your cities, you could actually just lose this game outright. After all that, you can't just check for victory conditions, and if nobody's won, you just spin that back around and start over again. That's the basic gist.
Okay, thank you. So let's then talk a little bit about how it feels to play, and maybe Eric, you could start us off with that. What feeling do you get with Antiquity?
It feels to me like a Splotter game. I'm going to talk about this more later, but it's definitely got Splotter DNA all over it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Just depends on if you kind of like that thing. So it's got the classic every turn is important. If you've played any Splotter game in the past, wouldn't you agree, Greg? There's kind of a feel to their games.
Yeah, for sure.
They're very knife edgy. They're very detail oriented, puzzle oriented. They're real thinky. So that's what it feels like to me. It does feel like a Civilization game to a certain extent, and I think that gets into the theme aspect of it as well. But I think more it's more a puzzle than it is a Civ game.
I think we've used in the past, we have used the word volatile to describe some things that might be adjacent to what you're talking about. Does this game, in saying it feels knife's edgy, is it swingy, maybe, or not? Not particularly.
It's like solving a mathematical equation, and at a certain point, when you've done all the work to think through this mathematical equation, and you realize at some point that you've done the wrong thing. You've way back in 5 equations ago, you made a mistake, and now you've got to basically wipe the chalkboard and start over. Yeah. It's that kind of a feeling.
I think what you're talking about, what I do think is the DNA for all Splotter games, although I think every Splotter game has a very significantly different feel to it. The one thread of DNA that runs through them all is that you have to plan way in advance. Every game they have is that way, and they're definitely much more strategy first games, right? They're never tactical games, so you do have to think. You have to think multiple turns ahead, and that's for sure.
And they're very opaque. They're very opaque.
They're hard to read multiple turns in advance.
Yeah, you can't. I don't think this Splotter games, you can't just sit down, read the rule book, have played some Civilization games in the past, and be like, I'm good to go. That's not going to win. You win this game.
Do you feel like is the opacity and I'm sure we'll discuss all around this, but does that come from chance or hidden information, which is chance as a type of hidden information, or is it just that it's so complex that you just can't do it?
It's the complexity. There's almost no hidden information in this. The only hidden information is I think it's just what the other player is doing on their turn as far as what they're building, right? Is that the only form of hidden information?
Yeah, but that's not even really, I mean, I guess it's hidden to a certain degree, but that's happening simultaneously. So you're all just kind of like putting your buildings in. It's just like one giant decision being made at once, though. So it's like saying, I can't see what decisions you're making inside of your head. I don't see that as being hidden information. The only piece of information in this game, I think, is the explore tiles. You can go out and explore, and you turn over one tile, and it could be like food, or it could be like wine, which is like a luxury item in this game. It's very, very minimal, but that's the only piece of hidden information in the game.
Almost no chance, zero chance, basically.
Zero chance.
It's a good example is, in my opinion, this is another example of Splotter's design protocol, where in this case, initial setup, you can lose the game on the initial setup. Where you place your opening city can lose you the game. So, I mean, that's great for some people. People who like Splotter games, they know that going in. So that's not necessarily a downside. Greg loves it, obviously. But that changes the feel of the game for sure.
Okay. All right. Greg, you have anything to add on feel of play?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously what he says is heavily strategic. Some of the things I think that differs a little bit here than other Splotter games. This is actually one of the meanest games I know, where the meanness comes from not other players, but the game itself. So you always talk about something like co-op games. You always talk about like, how mean is the game? And you flip over the cards at the end of a turn in Pandemic. How mean is that game? How is it punishing you? This one I think is way ramped up. In each turn, when that game drops that pollution down, forces you to drop pollution down, and you have that famine you got to deal with, it gets harsh. What it actually feels to me, if you want me to sum up what this feels to me, to a game that probably most people have played, and it's a very different game, but I still get a very similar feel. I feel like it's like Agricola amped way up. So that feeling you get when you play Agricola, where it's like in the beginning, especially when you're new, you're like, where am I getting this food from? I don't think I got enough time to get a food engine going. Like amp that up like 10 times, and that's kind of how Antiquity feels to me.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, if you've played Agricola, that's how this game feels. But other than that, yeah, I just think it does feel somewhat like a Civ game in the way that you expand out and you kind of get this civilization running with different technologies, and it becomes a little easier to do things. But it's just a mean Civ game.
Just play Agricola, and every round just drink a Red Bull, and that's Antiquity.
Yeah, well, play Agricola, but every round lose half your food. For no reason whatsoever.
We should do a YouTube Shorts channel just so that we can have Eric's 5-second reviews, but with snippets like that. I think. Yeah, no, I remember Greg, when we played Antiquity a long time ago, and I remember talking about it and how it's sort of like it is like, it's not a co-op game, but it's more like you're both simultaneously fighting the board, and you're not really trying to help each other, and it's so tight that if the other guy manages to smack you a little, it's a big problem, but enemy number one is the board itself.
Yeah, I'll be returning to this.
Okay, and so you guys mentioned kind of touched on that there, though, Greg, about it being, and you, Eric, as well, about it being a sim. How do you feel in terms of its theme as a Civ sim, or however you would classify it? How do you feel that it did, Eric?
Really good. Yeah, it's a Civ game. This is what I would call an ecological civilization game, which is pretty cool. It's pretty unique. It made me think about Dune, because Dune, the sci-fi book, was originally, the very in the foreword, Frank Herbert, his what do you call it when you his dedications were to ecologists. He thought of Dune as an ecological sci-fi story, and this to me is an ecological civilization board game, which is pretty neat. And the whole reason that is the case is because of the pollution and the feeling of limitations. Limitations abound in this game. So you've got city space. Your cities are just blocks. You have a polyomino kind of thing that you have to work the shapes of the buildings that you build into a limited space on your city. You're going to run out. You need to build another city. Resources are limited. Pollution is unlimited, so you can continue to pollute all around your cities, and then you can't get anything from polluted areas, so you have to find a way to clear the pollution. That's a pretty unique theme for a game, and I really appreciate that. Certain features of the game that promote this this kind of choking on your own filth feel. They do it in a kind of a lateral way, like the polyominoes in the city. That's not especially realistic, but that's not a bad thing, because I think it just goes to show that the designers knew what they were doing. They designed every feature of this game to reinforce that feeling of limits and claustrophobia, and they feel that is a major historical part of the world that they wanted to editorialize in this game, and they nailed it.
Yeah, just one word on the theme too. I want to add, because when I first played this game, I thought it was interesting that we were polluting the land in the Middle Ages, because I think you always assume pollution's like smokestacks and things of that nature. But actually, when I looked it up, Joris, one of the designers of the game, around the time of creating this game, was actually did a master's degree in history and biology, and this was actually a particular part of history that interested him. And he talks about certain books that he was reading. I actually just looked it up. Pan's Travail, which was about the environmental problems in Antiquity ages. And so about how like whole sections were just being of the countryside were just being, deforested because of the building ships, and they were burned and all this type of stuff. So this pollution that they're representing is how they actually did strip the resources out of the land during this time. And it opened my eyes to that, because I had no idea before going into this game that was such a big deal. So I thought they did a good job of capturing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea space, right? That certainly I think most people think of environmental problems as modern day problems. So the idea that they were dealing with environmental concerns in the Middle Ages is kind of a neat take.
Okay. And it's more than just the pollution. Like I said before, it's really about feeling like you don't have enough. It's about feeling limited, like you're choked, right? And even the things that the game does that aren't exactly what they're not exactly realistic. Like you have to put all the graves when you run out of food. You have to put them all within your city. You cannot put them in a graveyard outside your city. That's not quote unquote realistic, but it would be realistic to the limitations, that feeling of stress that would come with a real famine in a city.
Mhm.
That is mirrored by the fact that you have to fill your city up with these graves, and that's great. It's very thematic on a meta level.
All right, let's go ahead now. We're going to talk about strategies and priorities, since this game, as you guys mentioned, it's kind of puzzly. Sounds like kind of critical, especially at the beginning, the steps you take. So what are some things that a new player would want to think about coming in for the first time? Eric, maybe you want to start us off?
Okay. Greg's the master of this game, but my thoughts on this are that starting location is a huge deal. Give some serious thought to where you put your first city. Some suggestions would be try to be next to a large forest, try to be directly next to two different mountains, and try to be next to some water. That's a tall order to fill, but if you can, that's an optimal placement in my opinion. Number two, wood. Always have wood. Never run out of wood. Know where your wood is coming from several turns in advance. You don't have to have a ton, but you need to have a constant supply of wood, which is why you need to make sure you're nearby a large forest. Point three, try to use all of your resources each turn. Don't sit on resources. This one might be controversial because, well, it might be controversial because I might be wrong. But I think that you might want to try and make your resources, don't sit on them, don't hoard them. Try to make them work for you. That might be different when it comes to food, because you need food. You need some storage to hold food so that you don't have famines. But everything else, like wood and stone, I would say try to find ways to use that every turn. Have a plan for it at least. What point are we on here? 4. My second game, I shot myself in the foot because I didn't prioritize workers, getting more workers on the first 2 or 3 turns. You got to try to build more houses in your first 2 or 3 turns to get more workers to do more work. And yes, that it costs resources, but just like any other worker placement, this isn't worker placement, but like a worker placement game, you need to get those workers so that they can go out there and become farmers, become fishermen, whatever. Next point, don't worry too much about pollution until you have to. I prioritized things like dumps and what is it? Is it the biology, or I don't know which building it is that lets you clear. There's a building that
Oh, I
lets you
think that's
clear
the
pollution.
alchemy, I believe.
Alchemy.
Yeah.
Those are great, but I think they're mid to late game great, and I think there's better stuff early on. You can dump some pollution into the forest, and then finally build your long-term winning plan based off of the chapel that you build. So when you build the cathedral, you have to pick a patron saint, and that patron saint locks in your win condition, and that's going to be how you win. So like as you build your city, be looking at those cathedral options and figure out at that point, late early game to mid game, how you're gonna land this sucker.
Okay, yeah. I'm glad you talked about the worker placement. It was a question I had, was how worker placement-y is it, and to what degree is it beholden to more general worker placement strategies? So
yeah, not terrible much. You start with four houses in your city, which gives you 4 workers. The reason it's not terribly a lot like a worker placement is because usually when you put those workers out, when you turn them into a woodcutter, they're going to be out there for several turns. You're not going to see them anytime soon.
Mhm.
So it's almost more like area control and less like worker placement.
Okay. All right, Greg, what are your thoughts on strategies, and priorities?
So the problem with Splotter games is pretty much everything is important. So it's hard to. Yes, obviously workers are a big deal, and obviously that is a big deal. It's hard to like focus on all of that on your first game though. So what I've done is I've kind of come up with like 3 basic things I always tell people after I teach the game. Like, and here's 3 basic things to keep in mind. So I'll just go through those. First one, Eric said it. It's also the very first thing in the back of the rule book in their strategy tip section. Don't run out of wood. Ever. Never run out of wood. And if you are running out of wood, at least you need to make sure you're having 1 coming back on that turn. Because everything in this game requires you to build. It requires wood to build. Do you know who you get wood from? A woodcutter. Do you know how you build a woodcutter? With a piece of wood. So if you don't have a piece of wood to build a woodcutter, you could be locked out of wood for the game, and then you're basically done. There's other ways you could build a market, maybe, but I'm not sure a market requires, but you're in a world of hurt. So I always say that's basically a rule. Treat it as a rule. Never be in a position where you're out of wood or don't know where it's coming from. The second pointer I tell people is, because if you're not used to playing this game, it's your first time, you may not be aware how much you should treat pollution and especially famine with some respect. I think something like Agricola, even, you can kind of ignore the food thing until around harvest is coming around. Like, okay, how am I getting my food this turn? And you can like kind of work on it. This one, I think you need to respect it more than that, because that can snowball. And especially, I think Eric is right. I think you can get by with the pollution a little bit. I do think you need to be thinking about how you're going to deal with it, whether that is build a dump, which, by the way, is the biggest building in the game, and it's a bear to put up. But you could do that, but you need to be thinking about what you're going to do with the pollution, but especially the famine, because that will get out of hand quickly. So do treat that with more respect than you would other games. And third, the very first goal, I think, in your game, aside from probably getting more workers, is getting your second city up, and then eventually your third city. Because once you get your second city up, that tends to resolve a lot of problems. You start getting really constricted. You don't have resources you can collect. You're running out places to dump your pollution. You're running out places to build the buildings. A second city kind of immediately resolves that. They're expensive. They require luxury items, so they do take some planning. So kind of get on that track early-ish. Yeah, other than that, work city placement. Yeah, try to be near all the resources as you can be. Usually that's not too difficult. Try to make sure your city's touching water, because that allows you to open up the coastline later on when you build the harbor. But other than that, those are my 3 basic ones, though. The ones on there that I always tell new players.
All right, great. Okay, let's go ahead then and get into the things that you liked and the things that you guys did not like about Antiquity. Greg, we're going to start with you. What did you enjoy and think that Antiquity did well?
Yeah, so that strategic planning, that's what I like about Splotter games. I really enjoy that long-term planning where you have to look multiple turns ahead, and this game makes it very difficult to do it. I like strategy games way more than tactical games, and this is definitely that. Even when you put down a worker out to do resources, that's a worker you can't use for the future turns, and you have no choice. It has to spend as many turns as there are resources it's touching. So even that's like a big decision. Like, do I put this on the big field here where it's going to be like 8 turns or 7 turns collecting stuff, or do I put in this little patch over here so it's back in 2 turns? Like, all of that's like important to consider. And you need to work out, what are you going to do with the stuff you're collecting? Because your goods, if you don't have a storage unit, they just disappear from turn to turn. And I love that feeling that this requires that intense planning where you got to sit down and figure out your future turns. I always tell the story. One of the players I always play this game with, in the initial city setup phase, she spent 30 minutes building her city on the very first turn, because she began to realize how many turns out she had to think. And so I remember I just got up and went and did some work and came back. Are you done yet? So I mean, that is the kind of game that if you do have analysis paralysis, this can really stoke that, because you do have to think so far out. But what I like too about that planning, I notice this every game, especially the newer you are, where it just feels like you're in a hole that you can't get out of. Like, okay, this pollution is getting out of the hand. The famine's going to kill me. I need a second city, and I don't know how I'm going to get there. But then you buckle down, you put your head down, and you think about it, and eventually, over many turns, it happens, and it's just one of the greatest feelings in the world. I don't know. I love that feel that the game is just constantly beating you up, and you have to outthink it. And that's another aspect of it. It's just a mean game. I like mean games. I don't care for a lot of cooperative games, but if I do play a cooperative game, I want one that's going to beat me up. I like a mean one. I want one that you only win 20% of the time. That's kind of where I stand with co-ops, and this feels that way. But it's a competitive game. And finally, I do want to break up another aspect I think is kind of similar among Splotter games. That's also true here. And I know we kind of argued about this term a little bit on the Food Chain Magnate review. I'm going to use it again, but let me explain it.
Let's argue again.
But it does kind of have this sandbox feel. Let me explain what I mean by sandbox. In that it's not like you are locked into certain paths. The game, like this, like in Food Chain, you just had, here's all the cards you can have. You can hire whatever employees you want and do it the way that you want. This is a similar idea in that here's a box of buildings. Your city starts empty. Here's a bunch of buildings you can build. You work out how you're going to do it. Each building does something new. It gives you a new ability. It doesn't lock you in. Now, obviously, there's some that are better than others, but it does feel like you have a little box of toys that you can put this building down. Hey, this does this. Hey, this expands my borders. Hey, now I can do this. But it feels like it's giving me a room to play and try different things. I feel like there's different strategies that I can try each time I sit down. And that's the other thing too. So there's the cathedrals you build, for example. There's 4 end game conditions you can go for. Really 5 technically, because there's 5. Let's just say there's 5. But that each time you play one of those, you can try a different end game goal, and they all feel different. Like your strategy and how you approach them all feel different. So there's at least 5 plays there where you're kind of almost playing a different game because you're working on something different. So yeah, anyways, that's kind of wrapped up what I like about Antiquity.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that, first of all, it sounds like you're saying that a sandboxy type game is on the other end of whatever spectrum, like the other end of that spectrum would be a game that's full of baked in strategies. Is that right? Like,
yeah,
there's no baked in, nothing
to a
baked
certain
in.
extent. I mean, it's a trademark of Splotter games, is they allow, everything is broken down into a single item that you have to choose and put into your engine, right? Like, it's not like in other games, it's like I send a worker out, I go here, I get food. right? That's built in. For me to even send a worker out, I have to build a cart. So how many workers do I want to be able to send out each turn? Well, I got to build a cart for each one of those. How far do my borders to be out? Well, I'm gonna need to build stables if I want to go out. Like every little thing that you can do in a game is not just a boost. It's just a building you have to buy, and all these little pieces eventually come together to give you the set of rules that you are personally playing with on your board. If that makes sense. You start out with no rules, like you can't do anything. Okay, you want to send workers out, you do this. You want to be able to build another city or whatever, you need to do this, and you kind of like build your own private collection of actions. If that makes sense. So that's what makes it feel sandboxy to me.
Okay. All right. Eric, do you want to tell us what you liked about Antiquity and also argue with Greg about what it means for a game to be sandboxy?
I don't know if I'm feeling it tonight.
Yeah.
We'll see. But as far as what I like about Antiquity, I think it's unique. It's a very interesting combination of, well, maybe not combination, but just it's very interesting that Splotter decided to try their hand at a Civ game, and they did a very interesting take on it. So the whole pollution thing, the whole when most Civ games, you feel like you're expanding and growing and your empire is getting big and you're becoming mighty and you're Napoleon and Ra. And in this one, you just feel like the board is crushing you. It's kind of an opposite feeling. But that's interesting too. So it's unique. It's very clever, and it's in the way it makes that feeling come out. And in that sense, it's very thematic. And it's ultimately, I was going to say, it's very Splotter. So if you know what a Splotter game is, it's very Splotter. It's 100% strategy, 0 tactics. That is kind of, in my opinion, the hallmark of a Splotter game. And that can be cool because when you figure it out, when you sit there for 30 minutes before you put your city down, and then you realize that you did a good job, you feel really brilliant, which can be fantastic.
All right. Nice. Okay, well, let's go to the other side of the coin. What did you not like about Antiquity, Eric?
It's very Splotter. If you don't like Splotter games, then let me come back to that, though. I will say a couple things before I revisit that. First, it's kind of drab. So the thematic nature of the game is great, but it doesn't pop on the table really. Most Civ games, you've got plastic pieces that represent your city, and you've got plastic workers, and you're kind of it looks kind of big and cool and sprawling. This is not that way at all. But that doesn't interfere with the theme, but it's just something to bear in mind. It's got a lot of brown. It's a very brown game. So yeah, other than that, I would say the pieces, the components, I think Greg's going to mention this too. The components are super tiny and fiddly. Greg has extra storage solutions for his, but that didn't come with the game. And man, I can't imagine playing this game if they didn't have those. It's just little tiny bags of little chits, and the pollution pieces. The map itself, the board itself, is pretty condensed. It's pretty tiny, so the spaces are pretty small. So it's very, very fiddly and finicky in that way. But ultimately, the bad is similar in its heredity to the good, in that it comes down to whether you like Splotter games or not. They're not. I prefer a little bit of tactics thrown into my strategy games. So with a Splotter Civ game, that cleverness that it excels at can, in my opinion, obscure the feeling of the civilization game. It can, like I said before, instead of feeling like you're this growing mighty empire, it feels like claustrophobia. It feels like you're being crushed by the board. That can be good, but not always. It's at the very least very unique for a Civilization game. And again, like all Splotter games, I think that turns can become very mechanical when you start losing. For instance, if you have very little wood, you have that one piece of wood that Greg mentioned. There's only one thing you're going to be doing. You're going to be sending out a woodcutter. Your turns can be, I feel like the sandbox thing that Greg is talking about, that might only apply to the guy who's winning. The guy who's winning might feel like there's some room to breathe as far as what kind of strategy I want to play now. For a guy like me who's not who hasn't solved the opaque nature of this game or Food Chain Magnate or other Splotter games, it can, my first game was better. My first game, I was doing really well. My second game, I made some mistakes early on with regards to not getting my workers that I needed. And after that, my turns became very mechanical. It was very, well, I guess I can do this. And then I would place my thing and I'd be done. And I was hoping to kind of dig myself out of that hole. But you don't have many turns to do that in this game. I will say that one thing I should have mentioned in the good, I actually like the length of this game, at least for the 2 players. That's all I played it at was 2 players. I think the length of this game is really good for that. It doesn't drag on too much. So when my turns started to become repetitive and mechanical, and where I knew I just had to try to do these things I have to do these things to get myself out of this hole, I was able to suck it up and get through it because I knew the game wasn't going to last as long as, say, a Food Chain Magnate game.
How long did it take you guys, the 2 of you?
Like it says on the box,
2 hours?
3 hours. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like
those are my thoughts.
Yeah, it makes me feel like it sounds like for you playing this game was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube before you're crushed by a trash compactor.
Yeah, throw that up on the visual.
Anyway, Greg, what about you? What do you think you could have done better?
Sure, I'll talk about it. I don't like this. Actually, I want to ask Eric, this or Food Chain? Which one would you pick?
Yeah, they feel very similar to me. I'm going to talk about this in my final comments. Can I save it?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
I was just curious. Because for me, I don't like this game as much as I do Food Chain. For reasons I'll get into. I do feel it plays. I understand why it feels like why people say it feels like a Splotter, but I do feel it feels significantly different enough that I have a different opinion on this game. And that will come down to primarily the type of interaction this game gives that I want to address, because it differs significantly. There are actually nowhere near as many contact points in this game. In fact, there's hardly any at all. The only place where you actually interact with the other players is via like the pollution, because if you can start crossing the borders, you can start dumping your pollution into their boundaries, or you can start like dropping your workers to farm their area, and that's really the only place. There's no combat in this game. It's like a lot of Civilization games have like combat mechanics. This doesn't have that. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's because me saying that makes it sound like, oh, it's like a multiplayer solitaire game. It's not quite. And I kind of want to address how the interaction works in this game. And this isn't necessarily bad or good, but I always address interactions. I'm going to address it here. When I talked about Food Chain, I mentioned to me it felt like it was an engine that everyone was kind of building together. Like everything you did affected everybody else. So if I put this little gear here, now that changes what you're doing because everything's so tightly intertwined. If I had to come up with an illustration for this game, I think of it as, imagine you're in some sci-fi dystopian prison obstacle course where like you have to run through this obstacle course with all these like saw blades coming out the walls and like spikes shooting at you and things of that nature. And you're in this maze by yourself and you're kind of running and it's super hard. And then eventually,
Pretty sure I've seen this Schwarzenegger movie, by the way.
Okay, maybe. But yeah, imagine that Schwarzenegger is running through this type of an area. Okay, now imagine that you're on one of these like logs, and it's slippery, and there's like the blades are like swinging in front of you, and there's alligators beneath you, and it's taking everything in your power to not fall. And then suddenly you finally see another contestant, and they have a football they just like throw at you, and it hits you in the chest. Now normally that interaction would be minuscule, right? Oh, okay, he threw a football at me. Yeah. But in that particular situation, now that football being thrown to significant interaction, right? Because now you're dealing with all this other stuff. That football could be the thing that topples you to your death. So to me, that's how in Antiquity feels. You are so much of your time is being devoted to like just withstanding this assault the game is getting on you. That when you finally do start interacting with the other players, and they start dumping pollution into your stuff, or they take that piece of mountain that you need the gold for, that can really kill you. So even though the interaction is very few contact points, it's still significant. I like that. I like it better than most multiplayer solitaire games, but I don't like it quite as much as I do the full-on interaction of, say, a food chain or something like that. And because of that too, another thing I want to address is that low interaction, since you're not, especially the first few turns are kind of by yourself, you can start to create scripts in your head about how to address the game. Every time I play this game, the first time I play this game, it's like super tense. Like, how am I going to win this? This is ridiculous. This famine's getting crazy. Each time you go through, though, you kind of get those priorities straight. It becomes less and less tense, I think, because you kind of know how to set up your engine or set up your civilization so that you're getting the food that you need. So I think that becomes tense. And as you start to play a ton, I think you can start to get a pattern down. And because the interaction points are low, you don't have the other players in there breaking that up as much as I would like. Now, there is a random setup. The map is random in the beginning. That helps a lot. But generally, you have access to most of the resources you need. And I bring this up because even though I think I've played maybe a dozen times and I'm nowhere near this level, I still find plenty of things to solve when I play this game. I still love the game. But I do know people play this many, many, many times, kind of have scripts in their head to go, okay, if you want to win in 12 or 13 turns, do this, right? I am not there. And honestly, if you can get 50 plays out of a game before you get there, I think the discovery of that process would be pretty fun. You know, I'm not there, but I'm just saying, if that bothers you, you need to get 100 plays out of your game for it to be worth it. I mean, I don't know. From what I've seen, you might start getting certain scripts in your mind about how to win this game. And then finally, yes, those two are kind of, those are not super significant, but they do knock it down a little bit to me. Then the big one, that's actually what Eric mentioned, is the fiddliness of this game. Component wise, it's like playing a war game. I mean, it's tiny little discs and chits, and they're sprawled all over the board. And this is one of the only games I play where there are times when I'm setting everything up and pulling all the little pieces back that I just want to like flip the table sometimes. It's like there's too many things getting knocked down, or I forget to take something back. It's one of those kind of games where if that bothers you, it can get a little hairy. It's also a game where maybe you should have tweezers or something like that.
It sounds like the kind of game where if if the dog bumps the table, it's over.
Yeah, well, yeah, that could be it. There's just so many things hanging around, and because of that too, what Eric was talking about with the storage, most Splotter games you kind of got to have a storage solution because they're pretty minimal. But by the way, that's just the lid. Mid-review plot twist. I have the game right here. So I wanted to show, because okay, this is the box I have. So these are all the buildings and stuff like that in the city maps. I took all the resources out and put them into these GMT counter trays, which I highly recommend. Is it GMT or DVG? Anyways, these are like war game counter trays. So I have 4 here, 1 for each player. But they kind of expected you to put all these into bags, like 20 bags that you're dumping out onto the table. I don't know what they expect you to do with these things. So now what happens in this case, I had these actually in a Plano box for a while, and that was too cumbersome still. So I did, this isn't going into the box. So I have to store these separately from the game itself, which is a little annoying. I'm not going to lie. You got to have 2 different storage areas for it. There's no real good way to store this game. So I'm just going to throw that out there if that bothers you. And also, even when you get the game, I'll send you a picture of this, Micah. It's like just a giant stack of counter trays or counter sheets that you got to punch out. It takes forever to do that. So yeah, if that bothers you, if things get fiddly, it actually doesn't bother me that much. I mean, I do like board games too. Has the same issue there. But yeah, if that bothers you, super fiddliness, and you cannot store it properly, you have to buy secondary storage solutions. Just know that that's the case here going into this game.
Okay, let's get into our final thoughts on this game then. What do you guys rate it? Would you recommend it? Under what circumstances? And would you like to see it on either our 10 game or a 25 game shelf? And I'll start with you, Greg.
Yeah, just to re-summarize, I like the game. I don't like it as much as I do Food Chain. I give this game an 8. So it's still a game I really enjoy playing. The lack of the lack of constant player interaction is the biggest one that I think that pulls it down for me. But it makes up for it in very deep, heavy planning and strategy that I enjoy in the game. So for that reason, I give it an 8. I would not put it on the 10 game shelf, actually. That game, it's kind of hard shelf to get stuff knocked off there. I would put it on the 25 game shelf for sure, though.
Okay, well, we can have that discussion then in a minute. Eric, what about you?
Yeah, I think this is a really good addition for a Splotter fan. And even if you're someone who just likes Civilization games, I would recommend that you give this one a shot just to try it and see, because it's so unique. I would definitely play it again, but I find the crushing weight of importance that is delegated to every turn does take away some of the world building fun that I personally associate with Civilization games. That's just me. I play Civilization games for a certain thematic feeling that I can get, that this game doesn't give me, but this game does provide other stuff, Splotterish stuff. I don't think, to answer your question, Greg, I don't think it's as unique as Food Chain Magnate. I agree. I think Food Chain Magnate, I have the same issues with that as I do with this, just from a Splotter point of view. But I think Food Chain Magnate, you're correct in saying that there's something that game does. I mean, there's a reason it's on our 10, because I think it's very different. It's very unique. What you do in Food Chain matters to everybody, like Greg said. It's Food Chain Magnate. Not that this is a review of Food Chain Magnate, but Food Chain Magnate is entirely strategic, and it is almost 100% player interaction, which is pretty interesting. That's not this game, but it's still enjoyable. It's still a good addition to a Splotter fan, and I would not put it on the 10, but I would kick off something on our 25 for it. I rate it let me make sure I'm correct about this. I believe...
Curious, because you rated Food Chain pretty low.
I rate this a 6, but again, you have to remember a 5 to me is an average game. So I rate this slightly above average. The problem with this game is that it doesn't get any points for art, for picture, for the way it feels, and that's 2 whole points, off my.
It's going for like this old map look. That's kind of what it's going for. It doesn't bother me at all. I personally think this looks good, but I can understand if you're looking for something with more pizzazz. Mm-hmm. This probably wouldn't do it for you. It is very brown.
Yeah. It's very brown. Seems to be a theme in board games these days, is going with brown. I would maybe talk about Catan, since Catan is low and old and has it's on our 25. I mean, it's like Catan is the super child baby version of this game without the trading.
I did not expect Catan at all. That's I mean, yeah, I don't. Man, there's a lot of games on here I rate below Catan.
Well, the only reason I say Catan is that it is Civ adjacent.
Yeah,
in
but
a similar way, and I just don't. I'm kind of done with Catan, so I would rather have this game than Catan.
Sure, I don't think
I'm not directly comparing them.
Yeah,
I'm not directly comparing them,
because I'll tell you a few that I would get rid of before Catan. Just throw them out there. I would get rid of Azul before Catan.
You would get rid of Azul before Catan?
I'm trying to think because Azul is good as an entry level game, but we already have Catan.
I mean, why not? Why not get rid of Agricola? This is like Agricola on Red Bull. So
no, actually, that's funny. Interesting you mentioned that. Even though I love Splotter games, and I think I like Agricola slightly more still than this game. I think the cards of Agricola actually,
Me too,
make me prefer it slightly. I like this game. If I want something a little heavier, I'll definitely play Antiquity. But no, I wouldn't get rid of Agricola. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, Azul is my first pick. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm even cooler on Azul than I was when we reviewed it. But I mean, I like Catan.
I like
Dominion.
Catan.
I would probably get rid of Dominion before.
We can get rid of Dominion. There's a number of things that I'm not picky about. I'm not as picky on the 25. If it's
there's a lot of games here that I'm not super high on still. So
if it's particularly low in my rating system, I'm fine with getting rid of something and putting this game is more interesting than Dominion by far.
Sure. Well, I said Dominion. That's what I would go with for now. I recognize Catan's going to go eventually, but I would say Dominion.
Sure.
Okay.
Let me be blunt. I don't like Dominion. I don't like what it stands for, and I don't like you.
It's interesting too. We've been talking about the interesting take on Civ games. One of the interesting bits of trivia was Splotter at one point was working on designing a dungeon crawl game, and they gave up on it and they canceled that design. But to this day, I've always been really curious what a Splotter take on dungeon crawl would look like. It would be very different. But anyways, that's a side point. But it's interesting to me.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be. Yeah, it sounds like it would be super pleasant to play. So, okay, well, all right. So, goodbye Dominion from the 25 game shelf. It does seem like it's going to probably be a while until we make a change on the 10 game. It's hard to crack. So, what are we going to look at next time, guys?
Well, we have possibly something that I'm hoping that might make it onto our 10. I'm super excited about Hands in the Sea.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for a while.
Been talking about this for a long time. I've been itching to play this game. It is the spiritual successor to one of my favorite games, one of both Greg and our favorite games, A Few Acres of Snow.
Yeah.
And plus, I even like the theme better than A Few Acres of Snow. So we'll see. I have high hopes for it.
I'm excited to play that too. I should probably mention the whole Geekless stuff too while we're here in this section, right? So just FYI, in the description will be both links to our 10 and 25 game shelf if you're curious. But more importantly, I'll also put in a link to our board game review requests. So if there's a board game you would like for us to review, go there, add the game if it's not there, and if you see the game there, go ahead and thumb it up, just so that helps us decide what games we should review. So there you go.
Yep. Plus, we're coming up on YouTube. We're coming up on 100 subscribers.
Wow.
So we have been debating what to do when we hit this heretofore unheard of number at 100. Right. So we might do something crazy. Who knows?
We're about to break paper level on YouTube. Watch out.
Yeah.
Watch out. We might get a custom URL. It's pretty exciting.
Coming for you, Tom Vassell. Coming for you.
Yeah. So if you have suggestions for what we can do for the smallest conceivable milestone that could possibly be recognized, then please let us know.
What should we do for 100 subscriber bonanza?
And for that matter, we ought to say, because we don't say it a lot, but subscribe if you haven't, right? Let's get there. So
that's a thought.
How about that? Okay. So next time, Hands in the Sea. Are you guys going to review A Few Acres of Snow, or is that too because it's
you can't get it? It's we don't have it. I mean, you can play it online, but I mean, maybe I don't know.
I wouldn't do it so quickly after Hands in the Sea because it's supposed to be similar, but I would like to do.
Okay.
We'll see how we feel after playing Hands in the Sea.
There you go.
Nice. All right. Well, we'll look forward to that next time. And then, like we said, subscribe if you haven't liked the video. If you like the video. And otherwise, we will see you next time. This has been a piece of the action. And I know I don't remember if you've asked us the question, but I remember the episode, and I remember it was. Well, are you asking the question, or are you asking if
Why
you're
don't
gonna
Why
ask
don't you
the
go
question?
ahead and like I'm pretty sure if I read these off, Greg and I will know. I'm curious if you know off
It's
the top of your
something
head, Micah.
Starburst, right? It's if you read it and there's one of them says Starburst, then that would be the one I.
Yeah, option A, the Colvard Starburst.
Uh-huh.
B, the Picard maneuver.
No.
C, the quantum wave.
No.
Or D, the Delta Flyer.
Yeah, so A.
Okay.
Obviously.
Quantum wave is obviously made up. Picard maneuver was when he used to defeat the Ferengi, and
Or when he
And
pulls
one
his-
which
or when-
and one which
Delta
Picard
Flyer
would not
was
have
the
chewed him out for doing.
yes, no, he would have said congratulations on accomplishing that.
On,
Uh,
he would
and
have said
Pic- and, Delta
congratulations on
Flyer-
completing the me maneuver.
which is a clever homage because the Delta Flyer wasn't that Paris's special shuttlecraft he made
Yes.
Oh, really interesting.
Yeah.
I did not
Yeah,
know that.
in Voyager, that was
in
the
Voyager, yeah.
they tried to make a beefed up. Yeah,
Shuttlecraft.
Tom and Harry built a beefed up
Okay.
Yeah.
fighter,
Cool.
and it was called the Delta Flyer. So no, it's the
So
I think
was
Quantum
Tom
Wave
Paris,
is Mhm.
was Tom Paris, was he I mean the actor, not who did Tom Paris. So the guy who plays Tom Paris plays the guy in this Wesley episode that
Yes.
the question is about. Did he come back in the episode Lower Decks? Was that him too? Do you
Mm,
remember Lower Decks?
oh wait,
I remember Lower Decks. But was that him?
he was not in Lower Decks. I don't think. I think they wanted him to. There's a whole story here because he was actually supposed to be the same character as he was in Voyager too, because it would have fit in,
Oh,
right?
really?
He was in prison. He was
He was
getting
in
out.
prison. Yeah, it's true.
He was a
That's
good
true.
flyer, but for whatever reason, they changed their mind at the end. And there was something about Lower Decks too. Let me look it up actually, because I thought
You're
they
gonna have
wanted
to
to.
you're gonna have to
No,
parse
it's-
some of the
You're gonna have to
new
get around
animated thing.
the animated series now.
Oh, that's right. Silly animated series.
You have to go episode Lower Decks.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, we're talking about the episode Lower Decks here. No, he's not in there.
Okay. There's a character that plays kind of a similar. There's an actor who plays kind of a similar character in that episode. But yeah, let's for the sake of completion, let me make sure that it is
Yeah, no
indeed
idea how I'm gonna.
Colvard Starburst.
I did actually legitimately know
Wow,
Yeah,
half of
congratulations.
that
good
answer
job.
off the top of my head.
It's a good episode. So
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
it's you get to watch Picard chew up Wesley. It's always fun.
I choose not to answer, sir.
You choose not to answer.
And you
Yeah.
get the payoff of the wisest man Picard ever knew, the groundskeeper.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and yeah, I feel like that was a cathartic episode for a lot of
Mhm.
Wesley haters out there. So, all right,
All
very
right.
nice.